This episode is brought to you by Fuli Gemstones.
What is the line between, one's private possessions and the state's possessions? It's a hazy line. It's a line that is dependent on the discretion of the reigning monarch. This is the convention that Edward VIII exploited in 1936 when he became king, because the crown owns the crown jewels. We don't own the crown jewels. They are the property of the crown.
I'm Carol Woolton, the voice of Jewellery. Welcome to If Jewels Could Talk. I'm an author and broadcaster, and the woman who initiated the role of jewellery editor at magazines like Tatler and Vogue. This is a podcast for everyone, for people who do like jewellery, for people who don't realise they like jewellery, and anyone intrigued by fascinating facts, new ideas and forgotten histories. So join me as I tell sparkly tales and meet all sorts of people, delving into 4 centuries of jewellery culture and investigate what's happening now. Today, we've got an episode which is a true crime episode. It's a real whodunit, and I am delighted to welcome the historian author Richard Wallace to talk about his new book called The King's Loot. Richard, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now, will you briefly explain the premise of your book? We are talking about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. So this is a royal true crime. Richard, tell us a little about the book, and then we'll talk about why you wanted to write it.
Well, the book is really based on 4 episodes in the Windsor story, which I suppose you would more or less characterize as somewhat dubious. There's a lot of murky business going on in these, 4 episodes. So the first episode really where I wanted to focus on, because there are just so many questions, was when Edward, Prince of Wales's father, King George V, died in January 1936, and Edward became king until his abdication in December 1936. So that's one period which I wanted to examine. The second period was, of course, the burglary at Ednam Lodge. The third section is when the Duke of Windsor died, to the death of the Duchess of Windsor in 1986, when there was a lot of stuff which went missing. A lot of her jewels went missing from their mansion at the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. And the fourth episode, which throws up a whole lot of questions, is, of course, the auction of her jewels in 1987 in Geneva.
And that was an auction like there has been no other since. So the 1987 sale of the Duchess of Windsor's jewellery collection is how you open the book. And I'd just love to read a little bit of what you wrote, Richard, because it really sets the scene and shows how it was the most extraordinary event, not only in the jewellery world, around the globe at the time. You said the staid Swiss town was awash with limousines, journalists, European aristocracy and celebrities. All the best hotels and restaurants are bursting at the seams. Caviar, truffles, foie gras are in short supply, while champagne is flooding the market at ridiculously high prices. They've all gathered for what was billed as the auction of the century. No English monarch's possessions have been put up for auction before. The Duchess had exquisite taste. They told a story about the most famous love story of the 20th century and were pieces created with the finest gems by the great jewellery houses. So this was something that everyone wanted to successfully bid for a piece from this auction.
Yes, and, the auctioneers had actually done a good job, because they took the jewels on a world trip, and they especially focused on the US, on America. And in New York, Manhattan, they went on show, and also in Palm Springs, they went on show. And there were queues forming around the buildings where they were showing them. And people were only allowed X amount of minutes to actually go into the building and view the jewels. Such was the interest in this. It was just amazing. So This roadshow preceded the auction by a few months. The auction was in April, and the roadshow started in about February, March, or something like that. So it whipped up this frenzy of excitement because these were jewels that, hitherto had, appeared in, like glamour magazines, and that was the only time that they were seen. And Wallace was an influencer. She was probably the world's first mega influencer, certainly in terms of jewelry, but also for all, her style of dress, et cetera, et cetera. And she was married to, at one time, the world's most glamorous bachelor. So no wonder this thing built up over years and years and years, and it finally, just culminated in the auction of the century.
Your book is suggesting that some of the pieces that were bought at that auction were not what their provenance suggested.
Well, to be absolutely accurate, Carol, I'm quoting a very important source in the book, very close to both the estate, the Duchess, the infamous Maitre Bloom, who, I just controlled all aspects of the Duchess's life towards her
She was
death.
her lawyer.
Yes, the lawyer, and she cared for the estate. So a source very close to that, and the auction, and the auctioneer of the century, a Nicholas Rayner. So I'm quoting a source, an impeccable source, who makes these claims which have never been made before, which have astounded Windsor historians. That's the one comment I get is, why has this come out now? After so many biographies, after so many treatments of this whole story. And I can't quite answer that. The only thing I can think of, Carol, is that I'm a complete outsider. I'm not known. I'm a complete unknown. So maybe I have a clean skin here. And maybe he felt that he could talk about it. Talking about Michael Block, who was Maitre Bloom's private secretary.
Maitre Bloom became far more than the Duchess's lawyer.
Yes, she became her keeper, her confidant, her guardian, and in fact, you couldn't get access to the Duchess, even her closest friends, without Maitre Bloom being in agreement with that. And that was for a substantial period of time, years, several years. She was just shut away in her bedroom, on drips, curtains drawn. No one saw her. The only person that administered to her was a priest.
And so when I said this is effectively a true crime podcast and a alleged true crime podcast, how would you describe it? Deception, heist, crime? What word best describes it?
Well, if we look at the first section, which was when he was king in 1936, I would say that was theft.
What was happening? These were royal artifacts being taken from royal residences.
That's right. Look, and this is where the rub is, because the rub is, as an earlier guest of yours in a previous podcast, the wonderful Susie Menkes put it, what is the line between, one's private possessions and the state's possessions, the crown.
Publicly owned, yes.
Yes, publicly owned. What is that line? And it's a hazy line. It's a murky line. It's a line that is dependent on the discretion of the reigning monarch. This is the convention that Edward VIII exploited in 1936 when he became king. Because as I say in the book, all the presidents going right back to the 17th century is that the crown owns the crown jewels. We don't own the crown jewels. They are the property of the crown. And the inference is there that they can do whatever they want with them. They're theirs.
You also suggest in the book that he knew he was going to abdicate far earlier than people really realize. So he was beginning to think about how he would finance a lavish lifestyle with Wallace Simpson.
Excellent idea. And, I think that's absolutely right. Bear in mind that he had been, that Edward had a history of lavishing jewels on his girlfriends. And he was lavishing jewels and artworks and furniture on Wallace when they first met in the early 1930s. And I think in the book, I quote, a French poem or something about how Edward was a very well-known client of a Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels all throughout his, time as, a Prince of Wales. And so, yes, it was building up. His mother, Queen Mary, was really worried about stories that were coming her way about things missing from Buckingham Palace.
How do you know that?
Well, I think I cite the sources in the book. I mean, there's over 400 sources in the book, Carol. So you'll have to trust me that I'm quoting from a source there. But it really reached, a crescendo when his father died in January 1936. And he was more or less, whereas his, brothers were given £1 million in cash on the death of King George V, Edward didn't receive anything. Of course, he received the crown and Balmoral, but for him, money was so important. So he felt aggrieved at that point at the reading of the will in Sandringham in January 1936. And to answer your question, I think that's the start of when he thought, I'm going to chuck this and I'm going to get all I can get because I really don't want to be king. It's boring. It's fiddly. I want to be out all night partying and having a good time. So I'm going to take them for what I can get.
In the book, you describe where this great treasure trove of stones came from.
Yes.
Sort of earlier, Edward VII, the Delhi Durbar, all from the empire, some magnificent treasures that were gifted from the empire.
Yes, because up until the reign of Queen Victoria, the royal stockpile of jewels was severely, diminished because previous monarchs up until that time had a habit of either pawning them to fund wars or losing them in rivers or, giving them away or whatever. So it was, a bit of a shambles, but it was Victoria who really began the immense royal, or collection that there is today. It all started for her. And it would have been easy for Edward, when he was king, to go to Windsor, where these trunks and trunks of jewels were. They were in a dungeon on a dirt floor underneath Windsor Castle. It was guarded by a big door with a key this big.
So how big is that?
It's about, I would say, 1/3 of a meter, an ancient iron key that was kept by the royal librarian, Sir Owen Morshead. And all the monarch had to do was ask for the key. The key would be given. They would go downstairs through several flights of stone floors into the dungeon of Windsor, open the door, and Monte Cristo.
And you think he'd been doing that as Prince of Wales as well?
Well, no, because he wasn't king.
He didn't have that big key.
He didn't. He couldn't. He could ask his father if he could get the key, but the two of them loathed one another. So I doubt if George, who wouldn't do anything without the advice of his wife, Queen Mary, I doubt if he was going to.
Who loved jewels, and she wouldn't have let any jewel out of her possession.
That's right. And so I don't think that would have happened. But as king, he had carte blanche.
And so you think these were loose gemstones and he took them to Cartier Van Cleef to have them set?
Yes, I think given his nature, given his character, given his history, given his background, given his penchant for lavishing extravagant presents on his, girlfriends and whatever, I asked the question, what's to stop him?
When he finally left Fort Belvedere, which was his private home for the last time, Wallace wasn't with him, but you're suggesting that he had a huge amount of things that he left with, which were royal artifacts packed up.
Well, I am suggesting two things. That one, when it became unbearable for Wallace Simpson to stay in England in early December, and this is documented in the book, and again, I cite several key sources, is that she left with an immense amount of jewelry.
You said £100,000 worth.
Yeah, probably more. I thought it was more like 200,000, but anyway, I'll take your word for it, Carol.
No, I think that's what you said in the book. But that at that time
is immense. Plus, plus she had cash, so she stuffed this into suitcases, loaded the car, and headed off to,
You make her sound like quite a gold digger.
Well, a little segue here. This is not an anti-Wallace book.
Yeah, because I'm quite a fan of Wallace.
Because given her background, Carol, how she grew up, the abuse, the humiliation through all those years when she was growing up and, the daughter of more or less, a single mother and whatever, I wouldn't say extreme poverty, but certainly, a genteel poverty, to suddenly be given an opportunity where this vast vista of wealth and luxury forever had opened up before her. Who wouldn't have taken that opportunity? I mean, I would have taken it. Anyone would have taken it. So I think Wallace naturally did what her background dictated. She didn't want to go back to that style of living. And here was an opportunity never to go back, never, ever to go back to those days of living hand to mouth. So this is not an anti-Wallace book, but I think she would have done what 99% of most people would have done in those situations.
And then it got out of control. She didn't expect it to go as far as it went. And The Crown, if anyone's watched the Netflix version of what happened in The Crown, is entirely wrong, because they show Edward VIII making his abdication speech with her hand on his shoulder, like, come on, do it now, when she was actually out of the country, ringing, begging him not to abdicate.
Dramatic license is what I think they call it, Carol. But we love The Crown, don't we?
I like the first series, but I didn't like the subsequent. They got just like gossip.
So, we're going back to those first 12 days in December 1936. So she absconded with a huge cachet of jewels, some of which she had received from him previously, but there were probably a lot of uncut stones. But then there is a period of 2 or 3 days before his abdication speech on December the 11th, which are unaccounted for. He was in Fort Belvedere, a stone's throw from Windsor, and the loot, which was still in the dungeon. Who's to say he didn't pay that a visit? Certainly, the assumption is that when he left Britain in the early hours of the morning on December the 12th via the warship, that he did have a small Hessian bag full of uncut stones in his father's overcoat, which he wore repeatedly after the death of his father. Another little quirk of history there.
He left by train. Did he leave the country by train?
No, he left the country by warship.
By warship. So how many trunks were loaded onto that warship?
Well, the convoy, which I describe in the book, there was his car where he was accompanied by his friend Sir Walter Monckton and various police officers. But it was followed by a truck, an army truck loaded up with stuff. Now, this is in addition to truckloads of stuff which he had shipped from Belvedere to a royal warehouse near Windsor of all other, old possessions, which he couldn't really access until after the end of the Second World War. So there was a stash of stuff. I think I talk about, when the warship docked in France and he rendezvoused with the Orient Express, there were 1 or 2 whole cars that were devoted just to his luggage. And he never left those train, old compartments. He was hoarded up there with his luggage. So maybe he had some stuff there. We will never know.
Well, it's interesting from the fact that he subsequently tried to have a role, didn't he, back within the royal fold. I mean, history does repeat itself. We're reading this about Prince Harry in the papers at the moment. But this would suggest there was someone leaving forever who had no intention to return.
Yes, that is a very, very interesting point you've raised there. Was he leaving forever, or was he just making a cut? Was he, divorcing himself from his hereditary royal duties from that aspect? But don't forget, he was still a HRH. He was still a royal. I mean, you can't escape that, really. So I think he was escaping from the kingship, but I don't think he was necessarily escaping from royalty. He loved being a royal. I mean, he loved everything about it except the boring bits.
History does repeat, like I said. Now, so, okay, that sets the first scene. The second part is the burglary that took place at the home, the Berkshire home owned by Lord and Lady Dudley.
Yes.
So tell us what happened there.
Well, they had come back for their first visit to Britain as a couple in 1947, and they were staying at the Dudleys. And the Duchess, as was her wont, traveled with a vast amount of luggage, which was transported to the Dudley's house, including a trunk a case. They call it a jewelry case. Now, when we talk about jewelry cases in here, I think there still exists the actual Louis Vuitton trunk that she used for that visit. And it's about, I'm holding up my hands here, Carol, and for those who obviously are listening in, it's probably about just under a meter, 2 feet, something, 2.5 feet. It was a trunk. It was a small trunk, which was crammed with jewels that she wanted to wear during this visit. And during this visit, when she and the Duke and the Dudleys were having dinner at Claridge's, as one does, Carol, they were burgled. And the jewels disappeared. Some of them were scattered around the fields surrounding the house at Sunningdale, and some of it was recovered, but the major pieces were never recovered.
And this is where some discrepancies come in.
Huge discrepancies.
You don't know what the major pieces are that she had with her?
I think, again, in the book, I give a sort of inventory, and I quote the, insurer's inventory. But, the key words which everyone focuses on is at the end of this list, which were issued by the insurers at the behest of the press, who were all over this, as you can imagine, was the words, etc.
They gave a long list of jewels, descriptive, and then put other jewels, etc.
No, just etc.
Etc. So implying that they weren't mentioning them all.
Exactly. And I also quote Leslie Field, who has put together a list of some of the more important jewels, which she felt were the ones that disappeared. I'm holding up my hands here, Carol, for your thing to say is, in quotations, disappeared.
Not stolen.
Well, you'll have to read the book, won't you, Carol?
I have read it. And you put forward quite a few kind of cat burglars who were active at the time. And then you dismiss the fact that they could have done it because they were nowhere near, or they'd given up being a burglar.
Well, look, everyone thinks it's there was a lot of, when my book was coming out, it was, serialized in the Mail on Sunday. And people picked up that this was an inside job, that the Windsors had rigged this. They'd got someone to do their dirty work, all for the insurance claim. So that's the alleged crime there. The cat burglar, I always wanted to be a cat burglar. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a cat burglar. Who didn't want to be Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief and to be messing around with Grace Kelly? I wanted to be a cat burglar. So I thought, well, maybe it was a cat burglar who maybe have done this. And I set forth certain possibilities, names of people. In fact, I think I end the 3 chapters on Ednam Lodge with my likely suspect. It was a professional burglar working in the area whose penchant was to rob wealthy houses in that Sunningdale area, which was, still is now, as stockbroker belt.
So you think he was the most likely to have carried it out?
I think so.
What was amazing was that you describe how even the morning of the burglary, Cartier were delivering new jewels to her.
Well, yeah, one new jewel, a very important jewel, and you probably know what it was. I can't remember what I wrote in the book. But here's the rub. Here's the English sitcom aspect of this whole thing, is that Cartier delivered the jewel, and the Duke took possession of the jewel and then left it somewhere in the house, and they couldn't find it. So they had to turn the place upside down to find this Cartier jewel, which they eventually did. And of course, he was severely scolded by his wife.
And that came from somebody within the house at the time, that story?
Yes, it's a well-known story.
And so the next part of this alleged heist is that the insurance values, you say, don't tally to what they were actually paid.
Well, I think there are 2 aspects. One, the insurance value was astronomical. And secondly, it was paid almost immediately. I don't know what your experience is with insurers, but my God, you've literally got to bombard them to get any kind of, a recompense from things which you are just claiming. But this was paid within days. And they immediately fled to America on one of the Cunard super ships. Again, I think she fled with something like 85 pieces of luggage, stacks of cash, and still some jewels.
Do you think the palace interfered with that because they wouldn't have wanted this scandal to keep dominating the headlines? So they wanted it paid off, dealt with, forgotten?
No, I think the palace were fanning the whole thing. They wanted to get rid of him. And don't forget, he and his wife, his glamorous wife, lavish tales all over the women's magazines, ended up in austerity Britain in 1947, still under rationing. That was the real climax of people's, antipathy towards all the Windsors. So I think that the palace, well, I don't know, but if I was in that situation, I would be fanning the flames of this, that this man and this woman was so out of touch with the ordinary lives of hardworking Britons.
So later on, we're going to see that you think some of these jewels actually then reappeared to be in the Great Auction.
And in some cases, according to my source in the book, some of the missing pieces were replicated right down to the inscriptions, but they weren't the genuine articles. Look, it's a huge, murky issue, this whole thing of what actually of her original, or collection ended up in the collection that was auctioned in 1987. Don't forget that between 1937, when they got married, and up until the Duke died, she would borrow pieces from Van Cleef and Arpels and Harry Winston and Cartier. And she would say, look, I'm appearing at this ball or whatever. Wouldn't it be lovely if I wore a new creation? They said, yes, of course, because they knew it was going to be, just photographed, much as it is, all today. So they would loan her all of this stuff and she would never give it back. They'd have to repeatedly ask for these things to be returned. And when representatives of Cartier and Van Cleef turned up at the auction in 1987, they recognized, because they had the documentation of some of the pieces that she had, quote, borrowed, unquote, from them, that ended up in the auction.
And they had to buy them back.
Well, who knows who bought what, because some of the stuff is, shrouded in secrecy.
Now, Nicholas Rayner, who conducted the auction, well, first of all, we should say that the auction exceeded the estimate 30 times.
Yes. And again, I wrote some passages in the book that, again, questions some of this stuff.
You were there at the auction?
I was there. I didn't stay for the entire time because I was a very junior reporter on a junket with no money, whereas all these people were washing around me, dripping with jewels and handing out cash and whatever. And I was...
Who were you reporting for?
I was reporting for the Fairfax organization in Australia.
So they'd flown you over?
No, I was based in the UK at that time.
So it must have been the most exciting thing and had this massive impression on you.
To tell you the truth, I was somewhat revolted by the whole thing. It was just
What's
so...
wrong with you, Richard?
It was just so
You were at a moment of history.
Yeah, well, one doesn't know that. One just knows that one's got a freebie and there's all these beautiful people around one.
Did you feel out of place? What did you wear? I mean, people did dress up.
I know. I wore the only suit that I had with an overnight bag with 3 shirts, which I ironed on a desk in the room which I was staying in.
And did you know anything about jewelry at the time that you attended the auction?
Absolutely not, Carol. You weren't around at that time. The podcast didn't exist.
Now, did you meet Nicholas Rayner, the auctioneer?
I saw him in action. What a guy.
I only met him later in his life, post the sad fact he'd had a stroke. And I did go to his house and he had prepared something to show me, which was sort of imagery of how he had, described himself as a treasure hunter and hunted down some of these things to auction.
Yes.
But, people had told me at Sotheby's before I met him how he had been the most glamorous man they knew.
Oh, absolutely.
They said every woman in Europe was in love with him.
Yes. He was tall, blonde, thin, impeccably dressed by Anderson and Shepherd. clouds of cologne would precede him when he entered a room.
He spoke many languages.
He had this off-the-cuff manner, which was, I would imagine, just people, well, women swooned, men and women swooned. And he was the master of his art. And of course, he spent a lot of time in India as well, ferreting out jewels from the Maharajas and whatever. So he's a very well-traveled man, but the auction was a real turning point in his life. He became very ill after that.
And you think that it was the stress, possibly, of this auction?
The strain and the stress, absolutely. And I think I describe the moments leading out to when he mounted the rostrum and the real palpable air of tension and excitement. Very few people get to experience that. And then to command that. And I talk about what it's like to be an auctioneer at these huge auctions, to command that, to one's presence fills the room, and literally to orchestrate the sales of millions and millions and millions.
And of course, it wasn't just the room. People like Elizabeth Taylor were calling from by her pool in LA, and people were calling in from around the world, weren't they?
And there was a vast press that were contingent, of which a very tiny portion was this little cowering Australian boy trying to not upset anyone. But of course, I never knew all of this until obviously much later, what really went on behind the scenes, and one never does.
And what did go on? The added stress for Nicholas Rayner. Do you think he knew any of this?
Absolutely. And that's the claim made by my source, is that he told Sotheby's that some of the pieces were replicas. They weren't the original pieces. They were using the same carats, the same stones, replicated by the same jewelers who made the original jewels. But if you look at the catalogs, nowhere is this mentioned. So they were aware, but took no action. Highly controversial claim.
And you're saying nothing mentioned in the catalogue, but you suspect that these jewels, therefore, weren't the actual ones that marked the milestones in this famous love story.
This is a claim that I'm reporting in the book, made by Michael Block.
But when did Michael Block tell you that?
3 years ago. And he has recently reconfirmed that.
And yes. How did he know? He was Maître Bloom's
private secretary, yes. He was actually employed by Sotheby's during the sale. He wrote the introduction to the catalogue. He wrote stuff for their newsletters. So he was intimately involved in this, right from the moment when the team from Sotheby's went to the Banque de France near the Louvre and down into their vaults and dungeons and opened a special cage where the Duchess's jewels had been stored in their Morocco boxes.
And were you interviewing him for the book, or did this make you write the book?
I was interviewing him for the book.
And then this came out, which really confirmed your argument.
Yes, I was working for the government in intelligence services, and I was on my way out. This is about 4 years ago, Carol. I was on my way out, and as they usually do with someone who says they're leaving, they give them the most uninteresting, boring jobs in which to occupy their time. So they had me going over all their old paper files from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and, converting them into, digital copies. And I came across some Interpol reports from the 1980s about some of the Duchess of Windsor's, artifacts or possessions that were being fenced, i.e. sold in Europe, and questioning the, legitimacy of some of these sales.
And were these ones taken by Maître Bloom? Because she did take a lot and resell it, didn't she?
Well, not only her, but the household. And not only that, but the palace was implicated in some of this. There's a story in the book about a truck that mysteriously turned up and was filled with personal papers and whatever when she was basically, just comatose in the last few years of her life, and disappeared with a truckload of personal papers and stuff and disappeared into the night. A lot of things went missing. And again, this is documented in the book, to the extent that all of her expensive maquillage and makeup and stuff disappeared, and she was reduced to using cheap alternatives.
But she wouldn't have known.
No, and that's why they probably did it, because she wouldn't have known. I mean, literally, literally, Carol, this is the most heartbreaking and tragic part of the whole book, in my view, is the looting that went on in the late 70s and the early 80s from
She had
there.
no one to protect her.
No one, no family, nothing. Literally at the mercy of vultures. Because as you and your readers know, whenever there's a jewel, there's luxurious possessions, there's a maelstrom of greed that it seems to whip up. Jewels attract tragedy, greed, deception, fraud, deceit, cruelty. All of this stuff are elements of the Windsor story.
Do you think that any of the very well known of her pieces, like the flamingo brooch or, her big Cartier amethyst bib necklace, were any of those very famous ones copies?
Well, I tried to get this information from the jewelers, but of course it's a very closed shop and rebuffed client, a confidentiality. So I have no way of knowing. It's an aspect that I would encourage someone to maybe who wants to spend some time on this, maybe taking it further than I have, because I think this is only the first step. Some of this stuff, Carol, has been well known in private circles, but no one's had the guts or the courage to actually come out with it. Maybe someone else can take that next step.
The only thing I would say is that we got used and recognized in imagery the pieces that she wore and re-wore. And I'm thinking, if there was this sort of truckload of gems that had been effectively spirited away from the royal dungeon at Windsor, why didn't we see more? Surely there would have been more jewellery.
Well, as I said, I think what ended up in the auction in 1987 was a fraction of what she had. Who knows what was stolen? I mean, records were so bad in those days. I mean, she didn't even have an inventory of what she had. Or maybe that was one of the papers that was stolen from the house. Maybe the actual inventory was stolen and is somewhere. There are so many tendrils of loose ends here that will take another lifetime to tie up.
And if people have spirited things away, or Metro Bloom was taking loose gemstones, there's no way to trace that, is there? You would never know.
We would never know. And she wasn't the only one, Carol. Really, really tragic aspects of that period. Who knows what went missing? So there's so much more to tell here. But I've only a very short life, and I didn't want to spend the rest of it being welded to the Windsors.
And you say that from that time, the auction process changed and provenances became
absolutely
stricter.
Jewels are tracked now. There's, a vast database. You can't suddenly say, Carol, that I've got this 50 carat blue diamond, because people would say, well, there's no record of that ever existing. How did you get that? I was on a TV show with a diamond merchant. He said, no way would all that happen now. Whereas in those days, right up until 1987, records were vague, they were scant. Provinces were taken on trust, on word, on who was actually guaranteeing the provenance, Carol. So if your provenance is being guaranteed by a member of the royal family, I mean, most auction houses would lap that up, wouldn't they, in those days?
Well, even now, people want a royal jewel for sure. And that's what jewels are extraordinary. It is that tangible link to a moment in history, a royal house. So that's why there was such a mad scramble to get hold of these jewels at the auction.
And I can tell you that, today, the two most valuable provenances for jewels are Diana and Marie Antoinette.
People love a tragic heroine.
People swoon at the thought of possessing something like that.
Would you put Wallace in that bracket, really, as a tragic heroine?
I think in America she is. I think elsewhere she probably isn't. But certainly in America, she is still thought of, quite rightly, as the poor girl who made good.
So do you think, having written the book, Richard, and I want everyone who's listening to give their views too, any way they can, get hold of us, was this accidentally done or willfully intended?
I would say it's a mix of both. Each case is different. And by the way, the deceit and the deception and the fraud wasn't just practiced by the two protagonists. It's practiced by their circle of friends, the court that they had around them at the time, the coterie of people that they were associated with. Everyone in some way is implicated in this story, but it all radiated out from the core that was the relationship between the Duke and the Duchess of Windsor.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing it with us, this fascinating mystery, and for your research. And as I say, I want everyone to say what they think. And if anyone is out there with further information, please get hold of us.
Yes, look, I think there's more threads to the story than I was able to, uncover. Probably more, maybe, to even refute what I have written. And wouldn't that be good? I mean, it just keeps the whole story alive.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. For this and other episodes of If Jewels Could Talk, please go to our website, carolwoolton.com/podcasts. Do share it any way you can, and we love to have a rating and a comment. I try and run images on the YouTube channel. Again, it's Carol Woolton. And on Instagram, you'll find me at Carol Woolton. And of course, we now have the book out. It's in the UK at the moment. It's in all good bookstores and on Amazon. It's called If Jewels Could Talk, commissioned from the podcast. It'll be out in the new year in the US. I'll keep you posted as to the date. And it's being translated into many languages as I speak now, and I'll keep you posted about that. And join me again in 2 weeks for the next Jewelled Nugget, when I'll be joined by Solange Azaguri-Partridge. We're going to find out what it's like to have a huge office overlooking the Place Vendôme and have pieces in the permanent collections of several museums. She's going to talk about her career and her famous friends, so join me then. And thank you for listening. If Jewels Could Talk with Carol Woolton is produced by Natasha Cowan, music and editing by Tim Thornton, graphics by Scott Bentley, illustration by Jordi Labanda. You can find our sponsors at fullygemstones.com and me at carolwoolton.com.